The gravel crunched under Colonel Rebecca Hawke Sterling's boots as she walked across the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Crimson, her steel-gray eyes scanning the horizon where smoke still rose from the previous night's bombardment. What none of the men under her command knew was that in exactly 72 hours, this determined woman they'd spent months trying to undermine would make a decision that would not only save their lives, but alter the course of the entire Pacific Theater conflict forever. The morning briefing tent buzzed with the familiar tension of career soldiers preparing for another day of brutal warfare in the Solomon Islands. Campaign of 1943. Rebecca had earned her Silver Eagles through a combination of tactical brilliance, uncompromising dedication, and the kind of battlefield intuition that couldn't be taught in any military academy. Yet as she approached the assembled group of battalion commanders, she could feel the familiar weight of their skepticism pressing against her like the humid jungle air that clung to everything on this godforsaken island. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan, a weathered veteran of the European theater with 3 Purple Hearts and an attitude to match, didn't bother to lower his voice as she entered. "I don't care what Washington says about integration and progress," he muttered to the circle of officers around him, his Boston accent thick with disdain. "No woman will command my unit. I've been fighting this war since Pearl Harbor, and I'm not about to take orders from some desk jockey who probably can't even field strip an M1 Garand." The other commanders shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement while others stared at their coffee cups with studied neutrality. Rebecca had heard variations of this sentiment countless times since her promotion 6 months earlier, but it never stopped feeling like a physical blow to her chest. She'd graduated top of her class from West Point in 1938, served with distinction in North Africa, and had personally planned the logistics for 3 successful amphibious assaults that had saved thousands of American lives. Yet to these men, she would always be nothing more than an unwelcome experiment in military equality. Major Thomas Kane, barely old enough to shave properly, but possessing the kind of blind courage that made him invaluable in close combat situations, looked up from cleaning his sidearm with genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Sir, with respect, have you actually seen Colonel Sterling's service record?" The woman single-handedly reorganized the entire supply chain at Guadalcanal. "My unit was eating hot meals and receiving ammunition resupplies like clockwork because of her logistics work. That's not desk jockey material." Brennan's weathered face twisted into something between a sneer and a grimace as he spat tobacco juice into a dented coffee can. "Kane, you're young enough to still believe in fairy tales. I've seen plenty of officers look good on paper who fold the first time bullets start flying in their direction. This is the Pacific Theater, not some training exercise back in Georgia. The Japanese don't care about your college degree or your daddy's political connections when they're trying to put a bayonet through your ribs." The tent fell silent except for the distant rumble of artillery and the ever-present buzz of insects that seemed to find their way into every conversation on the island. Rebecca stood in the entrance for a moment longer, allowing herself to absorb the full weight of their doubt and hostility. She'd learned early in her career that confronting this kind of prejudice head-on usually backfired, turning skeptical subordinates into outright enemies. Instead, she developed a strategy of quiet competence, letting her actions speak louder than any argument she could make. Captain David Rattlesnake Rodriguez, a former prizefighter from El Paso whose scarred knuckles told the story of both boxing rings and brutal hand-to-hand combat, finally broke the uncomfortable silence. "Gentlemen, the Colonel is here. Maybe we should focus on the mission briefing instead of relitigating the entire military hierarchy of the United States Army." His voice carried the kind of authority that came from leading men through impossible situations and bringing them home alive. Rebecca stepped fully into the tent, her posture straight and her expression carefully neutral as she moved to the front of the assembled group. The map table was covered with aerial reconnaissance photos, intelligence reports, and tactical assessments that painted a grim picture of their current situation. The Japanese had reinforced their positions on the northern ridge overnight, effectively cutting off 2 companies of American infantry, who were now trapped in a valley with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the tent despite its quiet tone, "we have approximately 48 hours to extract Alpha and Charlie companies before the enemy completes their encirclement. Intelligence indicates that a full regiment of Japanese forces is moving into position to eliminate our trapped units, and naval support won't be available until the storm system currently approaching from the east moves through the area." She pointed to specific locations on the map with the kind of precision that came from hours of careful study and analysis. "The terrain in this sector is particularly challenging, with dense jungle cover that will limit our visibility and mobility. Traditional extraction methods are complicated by the fact that the enemy now controls the high ground and has established multiple machine gun nests covering the most obvious approach routes." The officers leaned forward despite themselves, drawn in by the clarity of her assessment and the obvious depth of her preparation. Even Brennan found himself studying the photographs with grudging attention, his experienced eye recognizing the tactical complexity of the situation they were facing. Rebecca Sterling had never intended to become a pioneer. Growing up on a cattle ranch outside Amarillo, Texas, she'd simply been the daughter who could outshoot her 3 older brothers, outride every cowhand on the property, and calculate feed costs and livestock inventories faster than her father's aging accountant. When the ranch foreman broke his leg during a particularly difficult calving season, 14-year-old Rebecca had stepped in to coordinate the operation of 6,000 acres and 40 hired hands without missing a beat. Her path to West Point had been anything but traditional. While other candidates arrived with letters of recommendation from senators and congressmen, Rebecca's appointment came through the intervention of a retired Army colonel who'd witnessed her organizing disaster relief efforts after a devastating tornado swept through 3 counties in the Texas Panhandle. She'd been 17 years old, working 18-hour days to coordinate food distribution, medical care, and temporary shelter for over 2,000 displaced families. The colonel had watched her transform chaos into order with nothing more than a clipboard, a truck, and an unshakable determination to help people who needed assistance. The United States Military Academy had been a culture shock that nearly broke her spirit during those first brutal months. While her male classmates bonded over shared experiences of prep school athletics and family military traditions, Rebecca found herself isolated and scrutinized in ways that went far beyond the normal hazing that every plebe endured. Her roommate assignments never lasted more than a few weeks, as parents complained about their sons sharing living spaces with a female cadet. Study groups formed and dissolved around her, leaving her to master complex engineering and tactical concepts through solitary, midnight sessions in the library. But Rebecca possessed something that couldn't be taught or inherited: an intuitive understanding of how systems worked and how to make them work better. While other cadets memorized battle formations and supply chain protocols, she saw the underlying patterns that connected logistics to strategy, personnel management to tactical success. Her senior thesis on integrated command structures and amphibious operations had been quietly circulated among Pentagon planners and would later influence doctrine development for the Pacific Theater. Her first assignment as a second lieutenant had been to the Quartermaster Corps at Fort Benning, Georgia, a posting that everyone understood was designed to keep her safely away from combat operations. The commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, had made his position clear during their initial meeting. "Lieutenant Sterling, I want you to understand that your presence here is the result of political pressure that's beyond my control. I'll treat you fairly, but I expect you to keep your head down, do your job competently, and avoid creating any situations that might embarrass this command." Rebecca had thrown herself into the unglamorous work of supply management with the same intensity. she'd brought to every challenge in her life. She reorganized inventory systems that had remained unchanged since the First World War, implemented new tracking procedures that reduced equipment loss by 40%, and developed training programs that cut processing times for supply requests by half. Her innovations saved the Army thousands of dollars and countless hours of administrative work, but recognition remained elusive. Her suggestions were implemented without attribution. Her reports were edited to remove her name before being forwarded to higher headquarters, and her efficiency ratings, while excellent, carefully avoided any language that might suggest she was command material. The attack on Pearl Harbor had changed everything, creating an urgent need for experienced officers that suddenly made gender concerns seem less important than competence and results. Rebecca's expertise in logistics and supply chain management became invaluable as the Army struggled to mobilize millions of men and move massive amounts of equipment across vast distances. Her promotion to major came with orders to North Africa, where she would be responsible for coordinating supply operations for an entire division engaged in desert warfare against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. The North African campaign had been Rebecca's proving ground in ways that no peacetime assignment could have prepared her for. Working out of a converted warehouse in Casablanca, she'd managed the flow of everything from ammunition and medical supplies to replacement vehicles and spare parts for a division operating across hundreds of miles of hostile desert terrain. Enemy air attacks, equipment failures, and communication breakdowns created daily crises that required instant decisions and creative solutions. Her breakthrough moment had come during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, when German forces threatened to overrun American positions that were critically short of anti-tank ammunition. Traditional supply routes had been cut by enemy action, and division headquarters was preparing to authorize a strategic withdrawal that would have cost hundreds of American lives and yielded vital terrain to the enemy. Rebecca had studied the situation for 6 hours straight, cross-referencing maps, weather reports, and intelligence assessments before proposing an audacious alternative, using a combination of civilian trucks, captured German vehicles, and a company of engineers she'd borrowed from another unit. Rebecca had organized a nighttime supply run through territory that was supposedly controlled by enemy forces. The convoy had reached the embattled American positions just as their ammunition ran out, delivering enough anti-tank rounds to break the German assault and turn a potential defeat into a tactical victory. The operation had saved the division and earned Rebecca her lieutenant colonel's rank, along with a silver star that she wore with quiet pride. The medal citation had been carefully worded to emphasize her exceptional organizational abilities and dedication to mission accomplishment, without explicitly mentioning the combat leadership aspects of her achievement. But the word had spread through informal channels, and Rebecca found herself with a reputation among junior officers and enlisted personnel as someone who got things done when others said they were impossible. The Solomon Islands assignment had represented both an opportunity and a test that Rebecca understood with crystal clarity. Her promotion to full colonel came with command of the 23rd Logistics Battalion, a unit responsible for supplying 3 infantry regiments, 2 artillery battalions, and assorted support elements spread across 4 different islands in some of the most challenging terrain the Pacific Theater had to offer. The position required someone who could coordinate complex supply operations while operating under constant threat of enemy attack, and Rebecca's North African experience made her the logical choice despite the concerns of several senior commanders. What made her situation particularly complex was the nature of jungle warfare itself, which demanded entirely new approaches to military logistics that couldn't be found in any existing manual or doctrine. Traditional European-style supply lines became death traps in dense jungle terrain where a single sniper could halt an entire convoy, and established procedures for equipment maintenance proved inadequate against the corrosive effects of constant humidity, tropical diseases, and equipment destroying vegetation that seemed to grow overnight. Rebecca had spent her first month on the islands conducting what she privately called her listening tour, visiting every unit under her command and talking to everyone from senior sergeants to privates about the practical realities of keeping an army supplied in conditions that seemed designed to destroy everything humans tried to accomplish. She discovered that standard issue equipment failed in predictable patterns that no one had bothered to document systematically, that local weather patterns created supply windows that lasted only hours rather than days, and that successful operations depended on understanding dozens of variables that existed nowhere in official planning documents. Her notebooks filled with observations that would have seemed trivial to staff officers back in Washington, but represented the difference between success and failure in actual combat conditions. She documented how certain types of ammunition corroded faster in specific humidity ranges, how vehicle maintenance schedules needed to be completely restructured to account for jungle conditions, and how medical supplies required entirely different storage and transportation protocols to remain effective in tropical environments. The breakthrough that established her credibility had come during her second month, when a critical supply drop to the 1st Battalion, 147th Infantry Regiment had gone disastrously wrong. The planned drop zone had been overrun by Japanese forces just hours before the scheduled delivery, leaving 800 American soldiers cut off in hostile territory with rapidly dwindling ammunition and medical supplies. Standard procedure called for waiting until the drop zone could be secured, a process that intelligence estimated would take at least 72 hours. Rebecca had studied topographical maps for the entire night, cross-referencing them with weather reports, tide tables, and intelligence assessments of Japanese troop movements in the area. Her solution had been elegant in its simplicity and audacious in its execution. Instead of using traditional parachute drops that required large, vulnerable aircraft flying predictable patterns, she'd organized a series of small boat deliveries, using captured Japanese barges that could navigate shallow coastal waters under cover of darkness. The operation had required her to personally coordinate with Navy patrol boat commanders, Marine reconnaissance teams, and local coastwatchers who knew the intricate details of reef systems and tidal patterns. She'd spent 48 hours without sleep, moving between radio stations and coordination centers, tracking weather systems and enemy patrol schedules, while managing the complex timing required to get supplies to the trapped battalion before their ammunition ran out completely. When the first barge reached the isolated unit's beach position at 3 in the morning, carrying not just ammunition and medical supplies, but also hot food and mail from home, the psychological impact had been as important as the material support. Word of Rebecca's innovative solution spread through the command structure faster than official reports, creating a reputation for resourcefulness and determination that transcended the usual skepticism about female officers. But her most significant innovation had been the development of what she called adaptive supply networks, flexible systems that could respond to changing battlefield conditions without requiring approval from higher headquarters for every modification. She'd identified patterns in how jungle warfare created supply disruptions and developed contingency procedures that allowed field commanders to request alternative delivery methods when primary supply routes became compromised. Her system included pre-positioned supply caches that could be accessed through multiple routes, cross-training programs that allowed different units to support each other during emergencies, and communication protocols that enabled real-time coordination between widely separated elements. The result was a supply network that could continue functioning even when individual components were damaged or destroyed, a capability that proved invaluable as the campaign intensified and traditional military structures faced increasing strain. Rebecca's expertise extended beyond mere logistics into the realm of tactical innovation, as she recognized that effective supply operations in jungle warfare required understanding enemy tactics and terrain features that directly impacted military operations. She'd studied Japanese infiltration techniques, learning to predict when and where supply lines would be most vulnerable to attack, and had developed countermeasures that protected her convoys while maintaining operational flexibility. Her success had not gone unnoticed by the men she supported, even those who remained skeptical about female leadership in general. Enlisted personnel began referring to supply operations as Sterling runs, acknowledging that her personal involvement generally meant the difference between receiving critically needed supplies and going without essential equipment for days or weeks. The junior officers who worked directly under her command had become fierce advocates for her methods and leadership style, having seen firsthand how her attention to detail and willingness to innovate had saved lives and improved living conditions across their entire area of operations. These officers would later become the foundation of her support network as she faced increasingly complex challenges and growing opposition from senior commanders who viewed her success as a threat to established military traditions. The intelligence briefing that would change everything arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in November 1943, delivered by a grim-faced captain from divisional headquarters who looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. Rebecca was reviewing supply manifests in her command tent when Captain William Hayes burst through the canvas entrance. Clutching a sealed envelope marked with the red classification stamps that indicated information of the highest sensitivity and urgency. "Colonel Sterling," Hayes said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety, "I need to brief you on Operation Thunderbolt immediately. This information cannot leave this tent, and I'm authorized to tell you that what I'm about to share will require decisions that could affect the outcome of the entire Solomon's campaign." Rebecca cleared her maps from the folding table and gestured for Hayes to continue, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal on the envelope. The documents inside contained aerial reconnaissance photographs, intercepted Japanese communications, and intelligence assessments that painted a picture of impending disaster that would test every assumption about American military superiority. In the Pacific Theater, the photograph showed massive Japanese reinforcements moving through the northern islands, including elements of the elite 38th Infantry Division that had been responsible for some of the most brutal fighting in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. Intelligence estimates suggested that enemy forces in the region had tripled over the past 2 weeks, transforming what had been a manageable tactical situation into a potential catastrophe that could reverse months of hard-won territorial gains. More troubling than the raw numbers was the sophistication of Japanese preparations, which indicated a level of strategic planning and coordination that American commanders had not previously encountered in the Solomon Islands campaign. The enemy had constructed elaborate defensive positions, using forced labor and engineering expertise that created interlocking fields of fire, covering every possible approach route to their primary objectives. Captain Hayes spread out a detailed tactical map that showed the positions of American units scattered across 4 different islands, each operating under the assumption that they were facing relatively light enemy resistance. The reality, according to the latest intelligence assessments, was that every American position was now surrounded by Japanese forces that outnumbered them by margins of 3 or 4 to 1. "The situation is worse than it appears on paper," Hayes continued, pointing to specific locations where American units were most vulnerable. "The Japanese have been using the storm season to move equipment and personnel into positions that give them complete tactical advantage. They've got artillery pieces positioned to target our supply routes, and they've mined every beach that could potentially be used for evacuation or reinforcement." Rebecca studied the photographs with growing alarm, recognizing terrain features that she'd personally surveyed during her supply operations. Roads that she'd considered secure were now commanded by enemy machine gun positions. Landing beaches that had been used for routine supply deliveries were covered by concealed artillery pieces that could destroy any vessel attempting to approach. The most devastating piece of intelligence concerned timing. Intercepted Japanese communications indicated that a coordinated assault would begin within 72 hours, designed to eliminate American forces piecemeal before they could coordinate any effective defense or withdrawal. The attack plan showed a level of detailed knowledge about American positions and capabilities that suggested enemy agents had been gathering intelligence for weeks or months. "What does division headquarters want us to do?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from Hayes's increasingly desperate expression. "That's the problem, Colonel," Hayes replied, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the fact that they were alone in the tent. "Division headquarters is ordering a general withdrawal to more defensible positions, but the logistics of evacuating 8,000 personnel under these conditions are impossible using conventional methods. The Navy can't guarantee safe passage for evacuation vessels, and the Air Force is grounded due to weather conditions that aren't expected to improve for at least a week." Rebecca felt the familiar sensation of being presented with a problem that had no acceptable solution using established procedures and normal chains of command. The mathematics of evacuation were brutal, moving 8,000 soldiers, their equipment, and essential supplies would require a level of coordination and resources that simply didn't exist under current circumstances. The Japanese had, clearly, planned their offensive to coincide with weather conditions that would minimize American advantages in air power and naval support, creating a window of opportunity during which ground forces would be isolated and vulnerable. Traditional military doctrine provided no answers for this type of tactical situation, where enemy forces held all the advantages and American units were scattered across terrain that favored defenders. "There's something else," Hayes continued, reluctantly, producing a second set of documents from his briefcase. "Intelligence has identified the Japanese commander responsible for planning this operation. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, formerly of the Imperial Army Staff College, considered one of their most innovative tactical minds. He's the officer who developed the infiltration techniques that were so effective against British forces in Burma." The implications were clear. They were facing an enemy commander who specialized in exactly the type of complex, multi-phase operations that were most difficult for conventional military structures to counter effectively. Yamamoto's reputation was built on his ability to coordinate simultaneous attacks across multiple objectives, while maintaining operational security that prevented enemy forces from anticipating his intentions. Rebecca examined the intercepted communications more carefully, noting patterns in the timing and frequency of Japanese radio traffic that suggested final preparations for the assault were already underway. The enemy was moving into final attack positions under cover of darkness and weather conditions that made American reconnaissance efforts largely ineffective. "Captain Hayes," she said finally, "I need you to arrange an immediate meeting with all senior commanders in the area. We have less than 72 hours to develop a response to this situation, and conventional evacuation procedures are going to get a lot of good soldiers killed." Hayes looked relieved that someone was finally taking decisive action, but his expression remained troubled. "Colonel, I should mention that Colonel Brennan has already stated his position on this matter. He believes that attempting any kind of coordinated response under current conditions would be military suicide, and he's recommending that we request immediate air support regardless of weather conditions." Rebecca understood the subtext. The senior male commanders were preparing to implement solutions that would likely fail, and when those solutions inevitably proved inadequate, they would need someone to blame for the resulting disaster. The emergency command meeting convened in the largest tent available, a canvas structure that barely contained the tension radiating from 8 senior officers, who represented every major unit in the Solomon Islands sector. Rebecca arrived to find the gathering already in heated discussion. with voices raised in arguments that reflected both professional disagreement and personal animosity that had been building for months. Under the pressure of jungle warfare, Colonel Marcus Brennan dominated the conversation from his position at the head of the makeshift conference table, his weathered face flushed with anger as he gestured emphatically at the intelligence photographs spread before them. "Gentlemen, this situation requires immediate evacuation using whatever naval assets are available. I don't care if we lose half our equipment in the process. Dead soldiers can't fight future battles, and that's exactly what we're looking at if we try to mount some kind of heroic last stand against overwhelming odds." Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 156th Infantry Regiment, nodded in agreement while studying casualty projections that painted a grim picture of American prospects under current circumstances. "Brennan's right about the numbers. We're facing a coordinated assault by forces that outnumber us significantly, positioned on terrain that gives them every tactical advantage. Military doctrine is clear: when facing superior enemy forces in unfavorable conditions, withdrawal to more defensible positions is the only rational choice." Major Thomas Kane, whose unit had been conducting reconnaissance operations in the northern sectors, disagreed with visible frustration in his voice. "Sir, with respect, withdrawal isn't possible under current conditions. The Japanese have positioned themselves to intercept any evacuation attempt, and our intelligence indicates they've been planning this operation specifically to prevent us from conducting an organized retreat. We'd be moving our forces directly into prepared ambush positions." Captain David Rodriguez, whose engineering company had been responsible for constructing many of the American defensive positions, spread out detailed topographical maps that showed the complexity of the terrain they were defending. "The problem isn't just enemy numbers or positioning. It's the fact that our current dispositions were designed for defensive operations against limited enemy forces, not for evacuation. Under fire, moving 8,000 personnel through jungle terrain while under constant attack would result in catastrophic casualties." Rebecca listened to the debate while studying the intelligence materials more carefully, noting details that seemed to have escaped the attention of her male colleagues. The Japanese radio intercepts showed patterns of communication that suggested coordination between multiple enemy units, but they also revealed potential vulnerabilities in the enemy plan that could be exploited by forces willing to take calculated risks. "Gentlemen," she interrupted during a brief lull in the argument, "I think we're approaching this problem from the wrong perspective. Instead of focusing on evacuation or static defense, we should consider the possibility of offensive operations that could disrupt enemy preparations before their assault begins." The tent fell silent except for the drumming of rain on canvas and the distant rumble of artillery from ongoing skirmishes in the northern sectors. Brennan's expression shifted from anger to incredulous disbelief as he processed what Rebecca had suggested, while other officers exchanged glances that reflected their uncertainty about how to respond to such an unconventional proposal. "Colonel Sterling," Brennan said slowly, his voice dripping with condescension, "I think the pressure of this situation may be affecting your judgment. You're suggesting that we launch offensive operations against superior enemy forces positioned on terrain of their choosing, using troops who are already exhausted from months of continuous combat operations." Morrison leaned forward with obvious concern, his tone carefully diplomatic, but unmistakably patronizing. "Rebecca, I understand your desire to find creative solutions, but we have to be realistic about our capabilities and limitations. The forces under our command are supply and support personnel, not elite assault troops trained for the kind of high-risk operations you're describing." Major Kane, who had been studying the intelligence photographs while Rebecca spoke, looked up with growing interest in his eyes. "Wait a minute, Colonel Sterling might be onto something here. If we look at the timing of Japanese communications, they're clearly not expecting any kind of aggressive response from our forces. Their entire plan seems to be based on the assumption that we'll react defensively to their initiative. Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward Kane for his willingness to consider alternatives, but she could see from the expressions around the table that most of the senior commanders remained skeptical about any strategy that deviated from established military doctrine. The weight of their doubt pressed against her like the humid air that made every decision feel more difficult than it should have been. Captain Rodriguez traced routes on his topographical maps with growing excitement, his engineering background allowing him to see possibilities that pure infantry officers might miss. Actually, sir, the terrain features that make evacuation so difficult could work in our favor, if we're willing to move small units through areas the enemy considers impassable. My reconnaissance teams have identified several routes that could allow us to position forces behind Japanese lines. This is insanity, Brennan declared, slamming his hand on the table with enough force to scatter the intelligence photographs. You're talking about dividing our forces and sending them on suicide missions through hostile terrain against an enemy that knows this ground better than we do. I won't be responsible for implementing a strategy that amounts to military suicide. The argument that followed revealed fundamental disagreements about leadership, risk assessment, and the role of innovation in military operations that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Rebecca found herself defending not just her strategic proposal, but her right to participate in command decisions as an equal member of the senior staff. Colonel Brennan, she said finally, her voice remaining steady despite the frustration building. Inside her, I'm not suggesting we abandon caution or ignore the risks involved. But I am saying that conventional approaches to this situation will result in the destruction of our forces. Regardless of how carefully we implement them, we need solutions that match the complexity of the problem we're facing. Brennan's response came with the full weight of his decades of military experience and his deeply held beliefs about gender roles in combat leadership. What you need, Colonel Sterling, is to remember your place in this command structure and leave tactical decision-making to officers who have the experience and judgment necessary for these situations. The silence that followed Brennan's dismissal stretched like a taut wire, filled with the kind of tension that precedes either collapse or explosion. Rebecca felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something far more dangerous, the absolute certainty that conventional thinking would lead to the systematic destruction of every American unit in the Solomon Islands sector. She stood at a crossroads that would define not only her military career, but potentially the lives of 8,000 soldiers who trusted their commanders to make decisions based on competence rather than prejudice. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Japanese forces had achieved tactical surprise, numerical superiority, and positional advantage, while American commanders debated evacuation procedures that would funnel retreating troops directly into prepared killing zones. Every hour of delay strengthened enemy positions and reduced American options, yet the senior leadership seemed paralyzed by adherence to doctrine that had been written for entirely different circumstances. Rebecca looked around the tent at faces that reflected varying degrees of skepticism, resignation, and outright hostility toward any strategy that challenged established military hierarchy. These were competent officers who had proven themselves in previous engagements, but they were trapped by institutional thinking that valued consensus and caution over innovation and decisive action. The weight of their combined experience pressed against her lone voice like an avalanche of conventional wisdom. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of rain and distant gunfire, "I need to share something with you that may change how we approach this situation. During my supply operations over the past 6 months, I've documented patterns in Japanese defensive strategies that create specific vulnerabilities during the preparation phases of major operations." She moved to the map table and began indicating positions with the kind of precision that came from months of careful observation and analysis. The enemy's strength lies in their coordination and positioning, but those same factors create dependencies that can be exploited by forces willing to operate outside conventional parameters. Their communications networks, supply lines, and command structures all follow predictable patterns that I've been tracking systematically. Major Kane leaned forward with genuine interest, recognizing the depth of preparation that Rebecca's observations represented. What kind of vulnerabilities are you talking about, Colonel? Specific tactical opportunities or broader strategic weaknesses? Rebecca felt a moment of clarity as she realized this might be her only opportunity to present a complete alternative to the failed strategies being debated around the table. Both, actually. The Japanese have positioned their forces to counter traditional American tactics, but they've created gaps in their defensive network that could be exploited by coordinated attacks using unconventional approaches and timing. She pointed to specific locations on the topographical maps where her supply convoys had encountered enemy positions, explaining how the pattern of Japanese deployments revealed their expectations about American response strategies. They're positioned to intercept evacuation attempts and repel frontal assaults, but they're vulnerable to infiltration tactics that target their command and communications infrastructure. Colonel Morrison studied the maps with growing uncertainty, torn between professional skepticism and recognition that Rebecca's analysis was based on more direct observation of enemy positions than any other officer in the tent possessed. Colonel Sterling, even if your assessment is accurate, implementing the kind of operation you're describing would require resources and coordination that we simply don't have available under current conditions. Actually, sir, Rebecca replied, we have exactly the resources we need if we're willing to use them creatively. The same supply networks that I've been managing for the past 6 months could be converted into operational support for small unit infiltration missions. We have personnel who know the terrain, equipment cached in strategic locations, and communication systems that the enemy hasn't been able to intercept effectively. The proposal that emerged from her detailed explanation was audacious in scope and revolutionary in concept. Instead of attempting massive evacuation or static defense, American forces would conduct simultaneous infiltration operations designed to disrupt Japanese command structures and supply lines, while those forces were most vulnerable during their final preparation phases. You're talking about gambling 8,000 lives on a strategy that has never been attempted under these conditions. Brennan interjected, his voice reflecting both anger and genuine concern about the risks involved. Even if your intelligence is accurate, the margin for error is so small that a single mistake could result in catastrophic losses across our entire area of operations. Rebecca met his gaze directly, recognizing that this moment would determine whether her voice would be heard or dismissed in the crucial decisions that lay ahead. Colonel Brennan, with respect, were already gambling 8,000 lives. The question is whether we bet on strategies that have already failed or whether we try something that might actually work. The debate that followed revealed fundamental philosophical differences about military leadership, acceptable risk levels, and the role of innovation in desperate circumstances. Rebecca found herself defending not just tactical concepts, but the entire premise that unconventional problems might require unconventional solutions, even when those solutions challenged established military traditions. Captain Rodriguez, whose engineering background had given him experience with complex logistical challenges, began asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements that suggested he was seriously considering the feasibility of Rebecca's proposal. Colonel, if we were to attempt something like this, what kind of support would you need from my engineering units? Primarily expertise in demolitions and communications, Rebecca replied, grateful for Rodriguez's practical approach to the discussion. Your people know how to target infrastructure effectively, and they understand the kind of timing precision that would be required to coordinate multiple simultaneous operations. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison remained unconvinced, his expression reflecting the institutional caution that had been drilled into him through decades of military service. Even if we accept the premise that this strategy could work, the political consequences of failure would be catastrophic. We're talking about implementing unauthorized tactical innovations without approval from division headquarters or higher command authority. The weight of that reality settled over the tent like a physical presence. Rebecca was asking her colleagues to risk not only their lives but their careers on a strategy that violated established doctrine and chain of command protocols. Success would vindicate her approach, but failure would destroy everyone involved, while providing convenient scapegoats for a disaster that might have been inevitable regardless of the strategies employed. The Japanese assault begins in less than 60 hours, Rebecca said finally, her voice carrying the full weight of the impossible choice they all faced. We can spend that time implementing evacuation procedures that will get our people killed, or we can try something that might actually save lives. But we need to make that decision now, while we still have time to act. Rebecca made her decision. In the silence that followed her ultimatum, understanding with crystalline clarity that waiting for consensus would doom every soldier under their collective command, she gathered the intelligence photographs and topographical maps with deliberate precision, her movements conveying a determination that cut through the paralysis of committee debate like a blade through canvas. "Gentlemen, I'm implementing Operation Nightfall immediately," she announced, using a designation she invented on the spot. "Major Kane, I need your reconnaissance teams to begin infiltration movements within the next 4 hours. Captain Rodriguez, your engineering units will provide demolition support and communications coordination. Anyone who doesn't want to participate can document their objections in writing for the inevitable court-martial proceedings." The tent erupted in protests and arguments, but Rebecca had already moved beyond the point of seeking permission or building consensus. She assigned specific objectives to each unit with the kind of authoritative precision that brooked no argument, drawing on months of detailed intelligence gathering that had given her comprehensive knowledge of enemy positions and vulnerabilities throughout the sector. "Colonel Sterling, this is mutiny," Brennan declared, rising from his chair with obvious intention to physically prevent her from continuing. "I'm ordering you to stand down and submit to immediate arrest for insubordination and reckless endangerment of military personnel." Rebecca faced him calmly, her hand resting casually on her sidearm in a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable. "Colonel Brennan, you're welcome to explain to the survivors why you chose institutional protocol over saving American lives. Major Kane, move your teams into position immediately. Every minute we delay gives the enemy more time to complete their preparations." The next 18 hours became a blur of frantic activity as Rebecca coordinated the most complex operation of her military career while operating completely outside established command structures. She moved between communication posts, supply depots, and staging areas with tireless energy, personally overseeing every detail of an operation that required split-second timing and flawless execution across multiple simultaneous objectives. Her first priority was establishing secure communications networks that could coordinate scattered infiltration teams without alerting Japanese monitoring stations to the scope of American preparations. Using equipment and personnel from her supply operations, she created redundant communication systems that allowed real-time coordination between units. Separated by miles of hostile jungle terrain, the infiltration teams moved through terrain that conventional military wisdom considered impassable, using routes that Rebecca had identified during months of supply operations, through areas that most officers had never personally reconnoitered. Her detailed knowledge of local weather patterns, tidal schedules, and Japanese patrol routines allowed her to plan movement windows that maximized concealment while minimizing exposure to enemy detection. Captain Rodriguez's engineering teams, proved invaluable in preparing demolition charges designed to target Japanese communication infrastructure and supply depots simultaneously, creating multiple points of disruption that would prevent coordinated enemy response to the American attacks. His expertise in demolitions allowed him to calculate charge placements that would maximize destruction while minimizing the risk of premature detonation that could compromise operational security. Major Kane's reconnaissance units demonstrated remarkable adaptability as they moved into positions that placed them behind Japanese lines during the critical preparation phase of the enemy assault. These soldiers, many of whom had expressed initial skepticism about female leadership, now followed Rebecca's tactical guidance with the kind of trust that could only be earned through demonstrated competence under impossible circumstances. Most dangerous phase of the operation involved coordinating timing across multiple objectives while maintaining communication security and operational surprise. Rebecca established her command post in an abandoned Japanese bunker that provided both concealment and communication access, working with a skeleton crew of volunteers who had chosen to support her unauthorized operation despite the obvious risks to their military careers. As the hours passed, intelligence reports confirmed that Japanese forces were indeed moving into final assault positions, unaware that American infiltration teams were already positioned to strike at their command structures and supply lines. The enemy's confidence in their operational security had created exactly the kind of vulnerability that Rebecca had predicted. But exploiting that vulnerability required perfect execution of an operation that had never been attempted under similar circumstances. The first strikes began at precisely 0347 hours, with simultaneous explosions targeting Japanese communication centers, ammunition depots, and command bunkers across a front that stretched for 12 miles through some of the most challenging terrain in the Pacific Theater. The coordination required to achieve such precise timing had demanded every ounce of Rebecca's organizational expertise and leadership capability. Rodriguez's demolition charges performed exactly as calculated, severing enemy communication networks at the moment when Japanese commanders most needed to coordinate their complex assault plans. The resulting confusion created opportunities for Kane's reconnaissance teams to eliminate key personnel and destroy equipment that the enemy had positioned for their dawn offensive. The psychological impact of the coordinated attacks proved as important as the physical damage inflicted on Japanese positions. Enemy forces that had been confident in their tactical superiority suddenly found themselves fighting blind against an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move and strike at their most vulnerable points with supernatural precision. Rebecca maintained operational control from her concealed command post, making real-time adjustments to the assault plan as battlefield conditions evolved and new opportunities presented themselves. Her ability to process complex information quickly and make decisive, tactical decisions under extreme pressure proved crucial as the operation developed beyond its original parameters. The success of the initial strikes created opportunities for follow-up operations that extended American tactical advantage throughout the morning hours. As confused Japanese forces struggled to re-establish command and control while dealing with continuing attacks on their supply lines and communication networks, by noon, what had been an impending Japanese offensive had transformed into a desperate enemy attempt to maintain defensive positions against American forces that seemed to be everywhere at once, striking with coordination and precision that conventional military doctrine suggested should have been impossible under the circumstances. The radio chatter that filled Rebecca's command bunker as the sun climbed higher painted a picture of systematic destruction across the Japanese positions that had been so carefully prepared for their dawn offensive. Reports flooded in from infiltration teams whose success had exceeded even Rebecca's most optimistic projections, but she understood that operational triumph would mean nothing if she couldn't survive the political firestorm that was already building back at divisional headquarters. Major Kane's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained excitement as he reported from his position overlooking the primary Japanese command bunker. Nightfall actual, this is Recon 6. Target Alpha is completely neutralized. Enemy command. Structure appears to be in complete disarray. We've identified at least 3 senior officers who were eliminated in the initial strike, and their communication equipment is destroyed beyond repair. Similar reports came in from 8 different infiltration teams spread across the operational area, each confirming that their assigned targets had been destroyed or captured according to the precise timeline that Rebecca had developed through months of intelligence gathering and tactical analysis. The cumulative effect was a complete breakdown of Japanese offensive capability just hours before their planned assault was scheduled to begin. Captain Rodriguez transmitted from his position near the enemy's primary ammunition depot, his engineering expertise evident in the clinical precision of his damage assessment. Nightfall actual, Engineering 7 reporting complete success on secondary objectives. Estimated 70% of enemy ammunition reserves destroyed, with secondary explosions continuing to spread damage throughout their supply network. Enemy forces in this sector are combat ineffective. But even as reports of tactical success continued to pour in, Rebecca knew that her greatest challenge was yet to come. The radio frequencies used by divisional headquarters buzzed with increasingly frantic communications as senior commanders struggled to understand how an unauthorized operation had achieved results that conventional military wisdom had deemed impossible under the circumstances. Colonel Brennan's voice cut through the tactical chatter with unmistakable fury as he attempted to contact Rebecca directly. Colonel Sterling, you will respond immediately and report your current position. You are under direct orders to cease all unauthorized combat operations and surrender command to properly designated authority. Your actions constitute the most serious breach of military discipline I have witnessed in 23 years of service. Rebecca recognized the tone of a career officer who understood that his own reputation was now inextricably linked to the success or failure of an operation he had opposed from the beginning. Brennan's anger reflected not just professional disagreement, but personal humiliation at being proven wrong by an officer he had dismissed as unqualified for tactical command responsibilities. The communication from divisional headquarters that followed carried the full weight of institutional authority and barely controlled rage. General Harrison's aide-de-camp delivered a message that left no doubt about the seriousness of Rebecca's situation. Colonel Sterling is hereby relieved of all command responsibilities effective immediately. She will report to divisional headquarters within 6 hours for formal charges including insubordination, theft of military property, and reckless endangerment of personnel under her command. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice joined the chorus of condemnation, his tone reflecting the institutional thinking that valued procedural compliance over tactical innovation. Rebecca, I don't care how successful this operation appears to be. You violated every principle of military command structure and created a precedent that could undermine discipline throughout the entire Pacific theater. The consequences of your actions extend far beyond this immediate tactical situation. The irony was not lost on Rebecca as she listened to senior officers condemn an operation that had saved thousands of American lives while simultaneously demanding her arrest for the methods she had used to achieve that success. She understood that military institutions valued predictability and control more than innovation and results, especially when those results challenged established assumptions about leadership capability and gender roles in combat operations. Major Kane's subsequent transmission revealed the broader implications of what had been accomplished during the past 18 hours. Nightfall actual. Intelligence intercepts indicate that Japanese forces are requesting immediate reinforcement and considering withdrawal from advanced positions. Enemy casualties are estimated at over 40% with their offensive capability. completely eliminated for the foreseeable future. The tactical success of Operation Nightfall had transformed a potential American disaster into a decisive victory that would influence the entire Solomon Islands campaign, but Rebecca recognized that her personal fate remained uncertain, regardless of the operation's strategic importance. Military justice operated according to principles that often had little connection to battlefield effectiveness or tactical innovation. Captain Rodriguez provided additional confirmation of the operation's comprehensive success as his teams completed their assessment of Japanese positions throughout the sector. Nightfall actual, our intelligence was completely accurate. Enemy forces had positioned themselves exactly as predicted, and their vulnerabilities were precisely where you identified them. This operation will be studied in military academies for decades as an example of perfect intelligence application and tactical coordination. But the praise from subordinate officers could not protect Rebecca from the institutional consequences of her decision to operate outside established command structures. The radio messages from higher headquarters grew increasingly threatening as senior commanders demanded immediate compliance with orders that would effectively end her military career and potentially result in court-martial proceedings. The most damaging communication came from Colonel Brennan himself, whose personal animosity toward Rebecca had been intensified by the success of an operation he had characterized as military suicide. Colonel Sterling's unauthorized actions have created a dangerous precedent that threatens the entire principle of military command authority. Regardless of tactical outcomes, her behavior represents the kind of insubordination that cannot be tolerated in any professional military organization. Rebecca understood that she faced a choice between personal survival and continued operational command of forces that were still engaged in combat operations against an enemy that remained dangerous despite their tactical setbacks. Her infiltration teams needed coordination and support to complete their withdrawal safely, but responding to headquarters demands would abandon soldiers who had risked their lives based on her tactical judgment. The decision she made in that moment would define not only her own military legacy, but the future of innovative tactical thinking within American military institutions. She keyed her microphone for what might be her final transmission as a commanding officer, knowing that her words would be recorded and analyzed by investigators who were already preparing formal charges against her. All Nightfall units, this is actual. Continue mission as briefed. Complete your withdrawals according to established timelines and rendezvous at designated rally points. I will maintain operational control until all personnel are safely extracted from hostile territory. The helicopter that carried General Douglas MacArthur to forward operating base Crimson arrived through morning mist that seemed to part like curtains before the most powerful American commander in the Pacific Theater. Rebecca stood at attention outside the temporary stockade where she had been confined for the past 48 hours, her uniform pressed despite the circumstances and her bearing unchanged by the formal charges that had been filed against her by 3 different senior officers. The court-martial proceedings had been scheduled to begin within hours, with Colonel Brennan leading a prosecution team that had prepared charges ranging from insubordination to reckless endangerment of military personnel. The case appeared straightforward from an institutional perspective. A junior officer had violated direct orders and operated outside established command structures, regardless of the tactical outcomes that had resulted from her unauthorized actions. General MacArthur's unexpected arrival had suspended the formal proceedings, creating uncertainty about whether the most senior American commander in the theater would support institutional discipline or recognize the strategic value of Rebecca's tactical innovations. His reputation for dramatic gestures and unconventional decision-making was legendary, but his commitment to military hierarchy was equally well established. The assembled officers who gathered to witness MacArthur's inspection included representatives from every major unit in the Solomon Islands sector, many of whom had direct experience with the consequences of Operation Nightfall. The testimony they would provide could either vindicate Rebecca's decision-making or provide additional evidence for the prosecution's case against her unauthorized command methods. Captain Rodriguez stood among the witnesses, his engineering expertise having provided crucial support for the infiltration operations that had disrupted Japanese offensive preparations so completely. His detailed after-action reports documented the precision with which Rebecca had identified enemy vulnerabilities and coordinated complex tactical operations across multiple simultaneous objectives. Major Kane had submitted written testimony that described Rebecca's tactical planning as the most sophisticated intelligence application he had witnessed during 3 years of Pacific theater operations. His reconnaissance teams had achieved objectives that conventional military doctrine suggested were impossible under the circumstances, largely due to the accuracy of Rebecca's intelligence analysis and operational coordination. The statistical evidence of Operation Nightfall's success was undeniable. Japanese offensive capability had been eliminated with minimal American casualties, saving an estimated 3,000 lives while securing tactical advantages that had influenced the entire regional campaign. Enemy forces had been forced to withdraw from advanced positions, abandoning equipment and territory that would have cost months of conventional fighting to recapture. But institutional military culture valued procedural compliance and chain of command authority more highly than tactical innovation or strategic results. The prosecution's case emphasized the dangerous precedent that would be established if officers were permitted to operate outside established command structures, regardless of the circumstances that motivated their actions or the outcomes they achieved. General MacArthur's inspection began with a detailed review of tactical maps and intelligence reports that documented every phase of Operation Nightfall, from initial planning through final extraction of infiltration teams. His questions revealed a comprehensive understanding of both the strategic situation that had existed before the operation and the tactical methods Rebecca had employed to achieve her objectives. "Colonel Sterling," MacArthur said finally, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command experience, "explain to me how you identified the specific vulnerabilities that allowed your forces to achieve such comprehensive tactical success against superior enemy numbers positioned on terrain of their choosing." Rebecca's response drew on months of intelligence gathering and tactical analysis that had given her unprecedented knowledge of Japanese operational methods and defensive strategies throughout the Solomon Islands sector. She described pattern recognition techniques that allowed prediction of enemy behavior and identification of systematic weaknesses in their command structures and supply networks. The general's follow-up questions demonstrated his recognition that Rebecca's tactical innovations represented genuine advances in military thinking rather than lucky improvisation or reckless risk-taking. Her ability to coordinate complex operations across multiple simultaneous objectives while maintaining operational security had required exactly the kind of strategic thinking that conventional military education was designed to develop. "Colonel Brennan," MacArthur continued, turning to address the senior officer who had led opposition to Rebecca's methods, "explain your assessment of the tactical situation that existed prior to Operation Nightfall and the alternative strategies that you believe would have achieved superior results." Brennan's response revealed the fundamental limitations of conventional military thinking when faced with circumstances that exceeded the parameters of established doctrine. His evacuation proposals would have resulted in massive casualties while yielding strategic territory to enemy forces, effectively negating months of previous American tactical gains throughout the region. The contrast between Rebecca's innovative problem-solving and the institutional thinking represented by her critics became increasingly apparent as MacArthur continued his investigation. Her success had been achieved through exactly the kind of tactical flexibility and strategic innovation that military institutions claimed to value but often suppressed in practice through rigid adherence to procedural compliance. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's testimony revealed the deep-seated institutional resistance to female leadership that had influenced opposition to Rebecca's methods from the beginning. His concerns about precedence and command authority reflected assumptions about gender roles that had little connection to tactical competence or strategic effectiveness under combat conditions. The assembled enlisted personnel who had participated in Operation Nightfall provided a different perspective on Rebecca's leadership capabilities and decision-making under extreme pressure. Their accounts described an officer who had demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical competence and personal courage that military institutions claimed to seek in their command personnel. Sergeant First Class Michael Patterson, whose squad had been among the infiltration teams that had achieved the most dangerous objectives, described Rebecca's planning and coordination as the most professional leadership he had experienced during 4 years of Pacific theater operations. Her attention to detail and comprehensive understanding of tactical requirements had enabled success under circumstances that would have defeated conventional approaches. General MacArthur's final questions addressed the broader implications of the precedent that would be established by the court-martial proceedings. His recognition that institutional resistance to innovation could undermine American tactical advantages in future operations seemed to influence his assessment of both Rebecca's actions and the prosecution's case against her. The tension in the assembled group was palpable as MacArthur prepared to announce his decision regarding Rebecca's fate and the future of tactical innovation within American military institutions. His choice would determine not only her personal career, but the willingness of future officers to challenge established procedures when circumstances demanded creative solutions to impossible problems. General MacArthur's voice cut through the morning air with the kind of clarity that had shaped American strategy across the Pacific theater for over 2 years. Gentlemen, I have reviewed the tactical reports, examined the intelligence assessments, and evaluated the strategic outcomes of Operation Nightfall. What I have discovered is that while some of you were debating procedural compliance, Colonel Sterling was busy saving the lives of 8,000 American soldiers. The assembled officers stood in stunned silence as MacArthur continued his assessment, his words carrying implications that would reshape command structures throughout the Pacific theater. The Japanese offensive that threatened to destroy our positions in the Solomon Islands has been completely neutralized. Enemy casualties exceed 40%. Their offensive capability has been eliminated, and their forces have withdrawn from advanced positions that we had considered lost. Colonel Brennan's face reflected the institutional shock of an officer whose fundamental assumptions about military leadership and tactical capability were being systematically dismantled by the theater's most senior commander. His decades of experience and carefully constructed career had been built on principles that MacArthur was now challenging in front of witnesses, whose testimony would be remembered long after the formal proceedings concluded. Colonel Brennan, MacArthur said, turning to face the officer who had led the prosecution case, your evacuation proposals would have resulted in estimated casualties of 3,000 dead and 5,000 wounded, while yielding strategic territory that cost us months of fighting to secure. Colonel Sterling's unauthorized operation achieved superior tactical results with fewer than 200 total casualties. The mathematics of military effectiveness could not be argued with or dismissed through appeals to procedural compliance and institutional tradition. Rebecca's tactical innovations had achieved objectives that conventional military doctrine suggested were impossible under the circumstances, saving thousands of American lives while securing strategic advantages that influenced the entire regional campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison attempted to salvage the institutional position by emphasizing the dangerous precedent that would be established if officers were permitted to operate outside established command structures. General MacArthur, regardless of tactical outcomes, We cannot allow junior officers to ignore direct orders and implement unauthorized operations. The principle of military discipline requires the principle of military discipline, MacArthur interrupted, requires officers to accomplish their missions using whatever methods prove most effective under the circumstances they face. Colonel Sterling identified a tactical opportunity that conventional thinking had missed completely, and she possessed the courage to act when others chose the safety of institutional conformity. The general's assessment continued with specific analysis of Rebecca's tactical methods and strategic thinking that demonstrated his recognition of genuine military innovation rather than reckless improvisation. Her intelligence-gathering techniques, operational planning capabilities, and coordination of complex tactical operations represented exactly the kind of leadership development that military institutions claim to encourage. Major Kane and Captain Rodriguez exchanged glances that reflected their vindication after months of supporting Rebecca's methods despite institutional pressure to conform to conventional approaches. Their professional judgment had been validated by the theater's most senior commander, whose recognition of tactical innovation would influence military thinking throughout the Pacific Theater and beyond. Furthermore, MacArthur declared, his voice rising with the kind of dramatic emphasis that had made his speeches legendary throughout American military culture, I am promoting Colonel Sterling to the rank of Brigadier General, effective immediately. She will assume command of the newly created Special Operations Division, with responsibility for developing and implementing unconventional tactical methods throughout the Pacific Theater. The promotion announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled officers, many of whom had spent months questioning Rebecca's qualifications for tactical command responsibilities. Her elevation to general rank represented not just personal vindication, but institutional recognition that military effectiveness required innovation and adaptability rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. General MacArthur's subsequent announcement revealed the broader implications of his decision for American military strategy in the Pacific Theater. The Special Operations Division will be responsible for identifying tactical opportunities that conventional approaches cannot exploit effectively. General Sterling will have direct access to intelligence resources and operational assets necessary to implement missions that require innovative thinking and tactical flexibility. Rebecca's new position represented unprecedented authority for a female officer in the American military, but MacArthur's emphasis remained focused on tactical competence and strategic effectiveness rather than gender equality or social progress. Her promotion had been earned through demonstrated capability under combat conditions, not through political considerations or institutional quotas. The formal ceremony that followed included the presentation of a Distinguished Service Cross that recognized Rebecca's tactical leadership during Operation Nightfall, with citation language that emphasized her exceptional tactical innovation and strategic thinking under extreme combat conditions. The medal represented official recognition of military excellence that transcended institutional prejudices about female leadership capabilities. Colonel Brennan's reaction to the proceedings reflected the profound institutional changes that MacArthur's decision had initiated throughout the Pacific Theater command structure. His opposition to Rebecca's methods had been publicly overruled by the theater's most senior commander, effectively ending his influence over tactical doctrine development and operational planning procedures. 6 months later, General Rebecca Sterling stood in her new headquarters in Brisbane, Australia, coordinating special operations across the entire Pacific Theater that had contributed to decisive American victories from the Philippines to Okinawa. Her innovative tactical methods had been adopted by conventional forces throughout the region, saving thousands of additional lives while accelerating the timeline for ultimate victory against Japanese forces. The Special Operations Division had grown to include over 5,000 personnel representing every branch of the American military, with training programs that emphasized tactical innovation and strategic flexibility over rigid adherence to established procedures. Rebecca's leadership had created an institutional culture that valued creative, problem-solving and adaptive thinking under extreme combat conditions. Her final reflection came during a staff meeting, where young officers presented tactical proposals that would have been considered impossible just months earlier. The willingness to challenge conventional assumptions and develop innovative solutions had become embedded in American military culture, creating capabilities that would influence warfare for generations beyond the immediate Pacific Theater conflict. Woman who had been dismissed as unqualified for tactical command had transformed American military thinking through the kind of leadership that recognized no barriers except those imposed by limited imagination and institutional fear of change. Her legacy would be measured not just in battles won or lives saved, but in the fundamental transformation of how military institutions approach the relationship between innovation and effectiveness. Rebecca Sterling had proven that true military leadership required the courage to act when others hesitated, the intelligence to see opportunities that conventional thinking missed, and the determination to achieve objectives regardless of institutional obstacles that stood in the way of success. The war ended in the Pacific on September 2, 1945, with Japanese surrender ceremonies aboard the USS Missouri. Among the Allied commanders present stood General Rebecca Sterling, now commanding the largest special operations force in American military history. Her tactical innovations had been studied and adopted by military academies worldwide, fundamentally changing how modern warfare would be conducted for decades to come. Years later, when military historians analyzed the Pacific Theater campaign, they consistently identified Operation Nightfall as the turning point that demonstrated how innovative leadership could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Rebecca's willingness to challenge institutional thinking had saved countless lives and accelerated victory by months, proving that true courage sometimes meant defying authority to serve a higher purpose. The little girl from Texas who could outshoot her brothers had become the general who changed military history forever. Her legacy lived on in every officer who chose innovation over conformity, every soldier who believed that impossible was just another word for untried, and every leader who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought against the limitations we impose on ourselves. What incredible story of determination and courage will we explore next? Hit that subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts who believe that one person really can change the world. Drop a comment below and tell us which historical figure you'd like to see featured next.